Today, we move on the topic of macroeconomics. Chapter 5 discusses foundation of macroeconomics. You have 5 minutes to read summary, P98, and then, there will be a short quiz. When and how did modern macroeconomics begin? What were its early concerns? 2. What do economists mean by inflation? How do we know whether the economy is growing or not? What is unemployment? 3. What are the main tools that the government can use to influence the economy? What's the difference between fiscal policy, monetary policy, and supply-side economics? 4. How do expenditures by someone become income for someone else? How do the different markets in the economy interact? 5. What do we mean by macroeconomic aggregates? How do we aggregate across all goods and services, consumers, and producers? 6. What are some of the long-run trends of the U.S. economy in the 20th century? Macroeconomics arose out the Great Depression of the 1930s. In response to the failure of existing economic theory to explain the causes and cures of the Depression, John Maynard Keynes put forth a new explanation of fluctuations in economic activity. The early concerns of macroeconomics were to explain how changes in the economy occur and how the government can influence economic activity. 3 main concerns of macroeconomics are inflation, the growth of the economy, and the level of unemployment. Inflation is an increase in the overall level of prices in an economy. The growth of the economy occurs when aggregate output increases over time. Unemployment is the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed. The main tools that the government can use to influence the economy are fiscal, monetary, and supply-side policies. Fiscal policy involves changes in government spending or taxing policies. Monetary policy involves changes in the money supply and interest rates. Supply-side economics involve policies aimed at increasing savings, investment, productivity, and other measures aimed at increasing aggregate supply. Expenditures by consumers and the government on goods and services are income to producers. The flow of money between the goods and services markets, the labor market, and the money market is illustrated by the circular flow diagram. Macroeconomic aggregates are such concepts as aggregate demand and aggregate supply. By aggregating, or summing, across all purchasers of goods and services, including consumers, governments, and foreigners, we arrive at the total amount of products demanded in the economy. This is termed aggregate demand. By aggregating across all the goods and services produced by all firms at different price levels, we arrive at aggregate supply. Overall, the U.S. economy has grown tremendously during the 20th century. Short-term fluctuations around this long-term growth trend are termed business cycles. A business cycle consists of a recession, a trough, an expansion, and a peak. There have been 3 recessions since 1970, with the most severe occurring at the beginning of the 1980s. Microeconomics examines the behavior of individual decision-making units, business firms, and households. Macroeconomics deals with the economy as a whole. It examines the behavior of economic aggregates such as aggregate income, consumption, investment, and the overall level of prices. Aggregate behavior refers to the behavior of all households and firms together. Microeconomists generally conclude that markets work well. Macroeconomists, however, observe that some important prices often seem sticky. Sticky prices are prices that do not always adjust rapidly to maintain the equality between quantity supplied and quantity demanded. Macroeconomists often reflect on the microeconomic principles underlying macroeconomic analysis, or the microeconomic foundations of macroeconomics. The Great Depression was a period of severe economic contraction and high unemployment that began in 1929 and continued throughout the 1930s. Classical economists applied microeconomic models, or market clearing models, to economy-wide problems. However, simple classical models failed to explain the prolonged existence of high unemployment during the Great Depression. This provided the impetus for the development of macroeconomics. In 1936, John Maynard Keynes published the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. Keynes believed governments could intervene in the economy and affect the level of output and employment. During periods of low private demand, the government can stimulate aggregate demand to lift the economy out of recession. Fine-tuning was the phrase used by Walter Heller to refer to the government's role in regulating inflation and unemployment. The use of Keynesian policy to fine-tune the economy in the 1960s led to disillusionment in the 1970s and early 1980s. Stagflation occurs when the overall price level rises rapidly. Inflation, during periods of recession or high and persistent unemployment. Stagnation. Three of the major concerns of macroeconomics are inflation, output growth, unemployment. Inflation is an increase in the overall price level. Hyperinflation is a period of very rapid increases in the overall price level. Hyperinflations are rare, but have been used to study the costs and consequences of even moderate inflation. Deflation is a decrease in the overall price level. Prolonged periods of deflation can be just as damaging for the economy as sustained inflation. The business cycle is the cycle of short-term ups and downs in the economy. The main measure of how an economy is doing is aggregate output. Aggregate output is the total quantity of goods and services produced in an economy in a given period. A recession is a period during which aggregate output declines. 2 consecutive quarters of decrease in output signal a recession. A prolonged and deep recession becomes a depression. Policymakers attempt not only to smooth fluctuations in output during a business cycle but also to increase the growth rate of output in the long run. The unemployment rate is the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed. The unemployment rate is a key indicator of the economy's health. The existence of unemployment seems to imply that the aggregate labor market is not in equilibrium. Why do labor markets not clear when other markets do? There are 3 kinds of policy that the government has used to influence the macroeconomy. 1. Fiscal policy. 2. Monetary policy. 3. Growth or supply-side policies. Fiscal policy refers to government policies concerning taxes and spending. Monetary policy consists of tools used by the Federal Reserve to control the quantity of money in the economy. Growth policies are government policies that focus on stimulating aggregate supply instead of aggregate demand. The circular flow diagram shows the income received and payments made by each sector of the economy. Everyone's expenditure is someone else's receipt. Every transaction must have two sides. Transfer payments are payments made by the government to people who do not supply goods, services, or labor in exchange for these payments. Households, firms, the government, and the rest of the world all interact in three different market arenas. 1. Goods and services market. 2. Labor market. 3. Money, financial, market. Households and the government purchase goods and services, demand, from firms in the goods and services market, and firms supply to the goods and services market. In the labor market, firms and government purchase, demand, labor from households, supply. The total supply of labor in the economy depends on the sum of decisions made by households. In the money market, sometimes called the financial market, households purchase stocks and bonds from firms. Households supply funds to this market in the expectation of earning income, and also demand, borrow, funds from this market. Firms, government, and the rest of the world also engage in borrowing and lending, coordinated by financial institutions. Treasury bonds, notes, and bills are promissory notes issued by the federal government when it borrows money. Corporate bonds are promissory notes issued by corporations when they borrow money. Shares of stock are financial instruments that give to the holder a share in the firm's ownership and therefore the right to share in the firm's profits. Dividends are the portion of a corporation's profits that the firm pays out each period to its shareholders. Connections to microeconomics. Macroeconomic behavior is the sum of all the microeconomic decisions made by individual households and firms. We cannot understand the former without some knowledge of the factors that influence the latter. Aggregate demand is the total demand for goods and services in an economy. Aggregate supply is the total supply of goods and services in an economy. Aggregate supply and demand curves are more complex than simple market supply and demand curves. An expansion, or boom, is the period in the business cycle from a trough up to a peak, during which output and employment rise. A contraction, recession, or slump is the period in the business cycle from a peak down to a trough, during which output and employment fall. Graph shows real GDP, 1900 to 2002. This graph shows real GDP, 1970 to 2003. Unemployment rate, 1970 to 2003. Percentage change in the GDP deflator, 4-quarter average, 1970 - 2003 2. Fill in blanks. 1. Government decisions on taxes and spending are called ________ policy. 2. Government tools to control of the money supply is called _______ policy. 3. The _______ diagram shows the flow of income and payments of the economy. 4. Since 1970, the U.S. economy has seen _______ recessions.